who is to propose the motion. Ladies and gentlemen, Aaron Bulger, senior freshman in theoretical physics, and Aaron is a maiden speaker. So, Mr. Bulger, do you choose to waive your maiden's rights or stick to it?
Yes, I'll waive them. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to open the debate tonight by speaking not specifically about the US election, but about voting in general, because I feel that the question of whether or not we should vote is one which applies to more than one country at one moment in time. And I'd like to put to the House two ideas. Firstly, that voting, for all its merits, is ultimately an exercise in futility. And secondly, that while democracy is certainly a good thing to which all nations should aspire, it is often undermined by a large number of a large percent of the electorate which is apathetic and often votes simply out of a feeling of duty rather than of any sense of interest in the issues at hand. And I believe that if these people who are not interested in the issues did not vote, democracy would be strengthened and it would be more healthy. The crux of my first argument is that our votes simply do not matter, not because of special interests or lobbyists or election fraud or anything else of the sort, but simply because of the sheer number of people voting in any given election. In the last 200 years or so, there have been around a dozen elections worldwide which have been decided by a single vote or were ended in a tie. To put this into context, an election in the UK is made up of 650 individual elections, and that's just one country, and this happens every 5 years. So it's not hard to believe then there have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of elections over the last 200 years, and only a dozen of these were decided by a single vote or less. Another way of thinking about this is to look at our own elections here in Ireland. What about a single vote in the 2011 presidential election, in which 1.8 million people voted, accounted for just 0.00006% of the overall vote, which is a margin smaller than pretty much every election in the last 200 years, bar the very few which were tied. You can see similar insignificance in Dáil Éireann elections, where there are typically around 40,000 votes cast per constituency. So what about all the elections which have been decided by 2 or 3 votes? What about the 3 Dáil seats in the last 35 years which were won by just 5 votes? Well, to put it bluntly, these elections simply don't matter. We each have 1 vote and not a single vote more. We can't even increase the power of our votes by packaging them together in the same way that, say, party whips are able to do, because the secret ballot prevents us from doing this. Therefore, the only elections that we are able to swing are those which have been won by a single vote or less. Of course, democracy isn't just about winning, it's also about having your voice heard. The reason that, say, cutting pensions is what Sir Humphrey would refer to as a courageous move is because old people vote and young people don't. While it is true that young people coming out in their thousands to cast their ballots would result in politicians talking about issues that relate to young people a lot more, your individual decision to come out and vote or to not vote will not have this effect. Remember that your individual vote counts for just 0.00006% of the overall vote, a number so small that it doesn't register to anyone, let alone a politician. So I think it's quite clear that we have nothing to gain from voting. On the other hand, the effort of going out to vote is certainly a measurable one, especially if you live in a rural area. While voting may not be difficult, relative to what you gain from it, it most definitely is. In much the same way as you wouldn't walk an extra 2 minutes to save 3 cents on your morning coffee, even though it's just 2 minutes, I don't think it's worth your while walking 10 minutes to have a 1 in 7,000 chance of changing your local TD, and even less of a chance of having that change having any effect on government business. And this applies to every democracy anywhere in the world. But of course, most people acknowledge that their vote is almost certainly not going to change the result of an election. Many, perhaps even most people, vote simply because they feel that it is their democratic responsibility. The opposition will most likely tell us that more people voting is always good for democracy, but I completely disagree with this assessment. On the contrary, I feel that large numbers of people voting on the contrary, I think that large numbers of people voting will have profoundly undemocratic consequences, resulting in some of the weakest in our society having their voices drowned out. In understanding what I'm saying, we must first ask ourselves what we mean by democracy. Well, it's the rule of the people, right? Well, yes, but what exactly does this entail? One phrase that often comes to mind is majority rule. Let's consider a hypothetical referendum which, if passed, will monumentally improve the lives of 40% of the population, while the remaining 60% of the population will be left largely unaffected by the change, though they may be slightly inconvenienced by it and are likely not to support the referendum. If we spend decades telling everyone that it is their democratic responsibility to vote in every referendum and election, then there will be a very high turnout in this particular referendum, and majority rule will dictate that this referendum not be passed. But what went wrong here? Our intuition tells us that this referendum should have been passed, because it provides the greatest good for the greatest number. The mistake that was made was in treating everyone's vote equally. I believe that those who are directly affected by an issue should have greater influence over that decision than those who are unaffected. Of course, we can't ban certain groups from voting, in spite of what Trump would like, nor would it be wise to play around with voting power of different groups of people, both of these setting a dangerous authoritarian and considerably undemocratic precedent. Instead, we should let the free market do it for us. Instead of encouraging people to vote because it's their civic duty, we should encourage people to vote only when it is a matter about which they care so much that it is worth the effort of voting, even given the insignificance of their vote. By doing this, those who perceive themselves to be directly affected by an issue would vote in very large numbers, those affected less in much smaller numbers, and those who are not affected at all would not vote, which is not what happens at the present. This weighting system would result in much lower turnouts, I will grant you that, certainly. But it would give a much greater indication of what is the greatest good for the greatest number, rather than simply majority rule. In most cases, it would produce the same result as majority rule, but on issues which affect a very small percentage of the overall population, this weighting system would be able to protect them against an apathetic majority who don't sympathise or perhaps don't care about their plight. Majority rule is absolutely fantastic, except when that majority simply does not care. For the record, I'm not for a moment suggesting that those who are moderate should not vote, nor am I suggesting that straight people, for example, should not have voted in the marriage referendum last year. I'm saying that those who do not care or do not believe that their lives would be any different regardless of the result should vote. Remember that moderation is not the same as apathy, and I would consider myself one of the many people who is a passionate moderate. So to summarise, I think that democracy is best served when only those who really care about an issue vote. We live in a world where voter turnout frequently exceeds 60 or 70%, rendering your vote useless. Until we drop the notion of democratic responsibility, drastically reduce voter turnout by encouraging people to choose for themselves whether or not to vote, rather than being encouraged by society, we will continue to drown out the voices of those who really matter in favour of those who have nothing to gain or lose. Until this happens, your vote will continue to be worthless, and I can do nothing but propose. Thank you very much.
I'll waive them. Ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen, unlike the previous speaker, I'm going to speak in the context of my beloved home country, the good old United States of America. The topic of a debate we are faced with tonight is a serious one. Over the past few months, the American election has grown ever more bitter and divisive. Understandably, many have been left disillusioned with the entire process. Many, as we well know, have decided to forego the democratic process entirely, choosing to stay home on election day rather than to go out and vote. My colleagues on the other side of the table would like you to think that this is an appropriate choice. I am here to tell you that this could not be further from the truth. The current American political system is, in part, a product of low voter turnout and a lack of political participation on the part of American voters. Americans imagine an ideal, almost utopian political system, yet they rarely take steps to bring about the changes they wish to see. Take, for example, an interaction I had with a voter while interning for a congressional campaign this summer. On the day of the primary election, volunteers and interns called through lists of registered voters, reminding them to go out and vote and asking them to vote for our candidate. One particular interaction has stuck with me. One of the voters I called complained about the fact that candidates these days, or rather their staff, would call to ask for his vote instead of calling to ask him what he thought about the issues. This sentiment was echoed by many other voters I spoke with. Now, this reaction frustrated me to no end, given that I'd spent the 2 weeks prior to the primary calling these same voters and inviting them to town halls with the candidate, where they would be able to speak with him in person about the issues they cared about. Most people were too busy, or didn't pick up the phone, or just didn't want to go. For all that people complain about politics as it is, they are apparently unwilling to put in any effort to do anything about it. The most direct and powerful way an average citizen can impact the government and the political system at large is by voting. Yet, voter turnout statistics leave much to be desired. Voter turnout in the 2012 presidential election was a mere 53.6% of the voting age population. According to the Pew Research Center, only 65% of the voting age population is even registered to vote in the United States. Now, we know that low voter turnout tends to benefit the more ideologically extreme candidates and parties. Contrary to what the previous speaker has suggested, when people who care more about an issue go out and vote, these are typically the more partisan.
If there was ever a threat by an extremist party, do you not think that large numbers of moderates would then decide to start voting?
All right, that's not the point I was about to make, but I'll go on here. Contrary to what the previous speaker has said, in practice, in American elections, and particularly in primary elections, the more ideologically committed or extreme voters are the ones who turn out in large numbers and then select a more ideologically extreme candidate for the party as a whole, which then has the effect of alienating the more moderate voters in that party. Now, given that the current level of political polarization in the American government is the highest it's been since perhaps the Civil War era, one cannot help but wonder if the American people have not brought this on themselves. We thus see that not only does apathy achieve nothing, but voter abstentionism contributes to the very same problems Americans profess to hate about their government, grievances which drive voter abstention. Now, a common argument by many Americans today is that the two main presidential candidates are both so bad that they can't possibly justify voting for either one of them. However, the premise of this argument is based on a false equivalency that presents the choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as a choice between the lesser of two evils. In the words of talk show host Seth Meyers, Americans just don't love the two choices. I mean, do you pick someone who's under federal investigation for using a private email server? Or do you pick someone who called Mexicans rapists, claimed the president was born in Kenya, proposed banning an entire religion from entering the US, mocked a disabled reporter, said John McCain wasn't a war hero because he was captured, attacked the parents of a fallen soldier, bragged about committing sexual assault, was accused by 12 women of committing sexual assault, said some of these women weren't attractive enough for him to sexually assault, said more countries should get nukes, said he would force the military to commit war crimes, said a judge was biased because his parents were Mexican, said women should be punished for having abortions, incited violence at his rallies, called global warming a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, called for his opponent to be jailed, declared bankruptcy 6 times, bragged about not paying income taxes, stiffed his contractors and employees, lost $1 billion in 1 year, scammed customers of his fake university, bought a 6-foot-tall painting of himself with money from his fake foundation, has a trial for fraud coming up in November, insulted an opponent's looks, insulted an opponent's wife's looks, and bragged about grabbing a woman by the pussy. How do you choose? Seth Meyers is brilliant. But if I had time to get into the gritty details of policy, we might see how Mr. Trump's policy proposals, or lack thereof, pale in comparison to those of Secretary Clinton, particularly considering that most of his policy proposals would probably end up starting a trade war with China. The bottom line is, there is a candidate who is qualified to be President of the United States, and there is one who is not. There is a candidate who possesses the appropriate experience and temperament which the office demands, and there is one who does not. Even if you still don't buy this, there are a few third-party candidates for voters to choose from, Jill Stein, Gary Johnson, and Evan McMullin being the main ones. These third-party candidates have many of their own faults as well, such as apparently endorsing the anti-vaccine movement or not knowing what Aleppo is, and none of them are likely to gain nearly enough of the vote to win the election. However, for those who feel the need to vote their conscience above all else, there are, shall we say, alternative options. But the office of president isn't the only one voters will be asked to fill on the ballot next week. If voters stay home rather than going out to vote for president, they also miss the opportunity to vote in down-ballot elections, including those for Senate, House of Representatives, and local offices. These elections are probably more relevant to Americans' everyday lives than presidential ones. And as President Obama has certainly learned, a president without a functioning Congress has little power to fulfill his or her agenda. George Bernard Shaw once said, "Democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve." Americans ought to go out and vote on November 8th. Either way, they will spend the next 4 years or more living with the consequences. I beg you to oppose.
Thank you, Ms. Griffin. I now call our second speaker for the proposition, Andrew Connolly, Senior Freshman Science.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are Americans in Trinity College Dublin. I've met many different people here in the past year. There's my friend from Libya by way of Navan. He prefers Libya, so I'm told. Apparently Libyan weddings are just dope as hell. There's my Polish friend, Austrian friends, and yes, I have met Americans. But most of all, however, there are Irish people here. From Sligo to Waterford, from Fermoy to Belfast, and perhaps even the north side of Dublin. Thousands of Irish people walk through the doors of Trinity each day. Now to them, I'd say they should not vote. Now why is this? There are many high-minded reasons why they should and shouldn't vote, but the main reason I think that they shouldn't is because most of us just don't really have US citizenship, and I think that's just kind of illegal. I think that's voter fraud. So really, I think when we say this house would not vote, I think it's this house would rather not pay a fine and spend up to a year in a federal prison. But to be honest though, voter fraud is almost like an American tradition at this stage, my source being Florida in the year 2000. When they stole a box of ballots, and I think they kind of buried it in a swamp somewhere, next to the 30,000 emails and the rest of that animal that Trump uses to make his hair. But what about the actual Americans though? What about those who can vote? To this, I think the answer is also not voting. It's your civic duty. Well, the United States is almost the perfect place to not perform your civic duty. The wrong person will win. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid to say the wrong people have been winning for a very long time. We have to fix the system. You can't fix the system from within the system, especially when the system itself is fixed. Now, what do I mean by this? You see, America... Even started yet. Now you see, America is big. Big cars, big buildings, big football stadiums, big corruption, big oil, big pharma, and a big old mess. Day in, day out, we hear about things going belly up in America. It's gotten so bad, Razorlight made a song about it, and people actually enjoyed it. That just shouldn't happen. Right? To illustrate my point, I'm going to discuss 4 people, starting with the least, Jill Stein. Mrs. Stein is the US Green Party candidate. She is a graduate of Harvard Medical School, and she believes that Wi-Fi is bad for your health, and she is thoroughly anti-vaccine. Now, I'm not going to comment on the Wi-Fi thing, because I feel that would just really explain whatever the hell happened to computer scientists, that could just be the lack of sunlight. As for the power of vaccines, that's just a no-brainer. Then we have Gary Johnson, and I can hear you wondering, who the hell's Gary Johnson? And you're goddamn right. He's the Democrat pretending to be a libertarian. He's the guy who doesn't know what Aleppo is. He failed to name a single world leader, and when specifically pressed, he had no idea who the leader of North Korea was. The answer is, I am. But really, I'm just joking, don't worry. I have a better chance of becoming the leader of North Korea than he does of becoming president. And now for the other 2. We're going to hear a lot about crooked Hillary and throbbing misogynist Trump during this debate tonight. It made up the bulk of the last 3 presidential debates. Now, I'm not going to try to equate the 2. One deleted some emails in a shady manner, and the other did a load of things pretty bad, which is what Sarah said. Now, one is definitely worse than the other, but neither is really good. Neither really deserves your vote, in my opinion. We need to consider this. Donald Trump is the embodiment of a large portion of the US population. And if he's their figurehead, if he's the center around which they gather, I think that says a lot about that proportion of society. It really shouldn't be that hard to conjure up someone to defeat Trump, a man who has more in common with Pepe, the white supremacist frog, than the Republican elephant. And yet here we are, 5 days ahead of the election, with polls giving Trump a razor's edge of a lead. Now, Clinton's transgressions in the State Department, my Libyan friend has a big L bone to pick with Hillary, these hinder her greatly. The FBI reopening their investigation does this too. The fact that these are the two people poised to become like leader of the free world, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the woman who can't beat him in literally 5 minutes, doesn't bode well for America. Ladies and gentlemen, America is a little bit broken. Irreparably so, I fear. We have militarized police harassing North American tribes who just don't want their drinking water ruined for the sake of a new oil pipeline. There's been a black president in office for almost 8 years now, and we still have people convinced black lives do not matter. Yesterday, I got one of those Facebook notifications. 4 years ago, I made a status about climate change denial in Mitt Romney's campaign. As you can see, I was a really cool 16-year-old, and that's just kind of what I talked about in my spare time. I want to know when this absolute sewage of this election became normalized. If Mitt made any allusions to grabbing women, he'd be done. If he stood up on the podium and said, global warming is a Chinese conspiracy, tweeted about it 50 times, then later on just went, no, I didn't. He'd just be gone. How that became normal is just beyond me. Now, what we really need to ask, is this what the men of the 1776 Rising died for? In his farewell address, George Washington warned against the dangers of party politics. That is exactly what America is. Americans derive great pride from the foresight of their founding fathers. The Declaration of American Independence, the Bill of Rights. These are masterful documents that are exalted as the cornerstones of American life and or stolen by Nicolas Cage. Corruption, division, and intolerance has become so ingrained in the United States, it cannot be solved, at least by working within the system. This is the system that managed to weaponize the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. We now have a private prison industry which leeches on ethnic minorities for profits. Thanks, Reagan. Smash the state, shake it up, decide that the Star-Spangled Banner simply isn't for you. Red, white, and blue just aren't your colors. I don't think we can save America. Maybe we can, but I definitely know voting isn't the way to do this. In the musical Hamilton, America is a great unfinished symphony. Someone let Good Charlotte at it. There's no more Prince to save us now. It's just not worth voting, I don't think. It's worth changing things up entirely or leaving, hoping that not what America was, but what America has become will be forgotten. This House would not vote. Voting has failed America and has failed the people. This House would do anything else. This House would have the time of its life. This House would not become a part of the machine that kills America for good. I'm very proud to propose.
Your eyesight is the second thing to go when you grow old. I spent 20 years in Ireland and went to America and spent 50 years there, came back 10 years ago. So for those of you who are math challenged, I'm 80 years of age. I would have gone to Trinity Law School, except the good Archbishop John Charles McQuaid said no, I couldn't. I didn't want to go to UCD because I knew all my friends would be there, so I thought if I went here, I could become a solicitor, barrister, whatever. So after the good Archbishop said no Catholics could go to Trinity, I said to hell with the whole thing, and I went to America. Numbers count, whether it's in a political race, election, or in a march, or supporters for a football team. Numbers do count. Your vote can be different, and yet I think it gives you a sense of pride, like paying taxes, that you're contributing. I know. But you all know where I'm coming from. When you pay a little tax, you're part of the institution. And when you vote, you're part of the institution. Not a small part, a great big part, because everyone is beautiful. In 1966, Richard Nixon, Republican, ran against Hubert Humphrey, Democrat. Nixon, 31.7 million votes. Humphrey, 31.2 million. A 500,000 difference. Young people didn't participate in that vote because the left-wing extremists told them, your vote does not count. Now, had they voted, Humphrey would have won. A wonderful libertarian, a wonderful civil rights man, a man who would have stopped the war in Vietnam within a year. But because there were those who said, oh, my vote doesn't count, and I'm angry, and I'm going to get even with the system, so I won't register, I won't vote, we wound up with Richard Nixon. In 2000, George Bush got 50.4 million votes, and Al Gore, 50.9 million. More popular votes, but less of the Electoral College. In that year, the state of Florida was won by George Bush by 570 votes. And far too many young people in Florida said, oh, I'm not voting because there's no difference between the two of them. I suggest to you that Al Gore won that race, there would be no invasion in Iraq. There are two ways of gaining or transferring political power: the ballot or the bullet. And you argue voting is a waste of time? I rest my case. Choose between the ballot and the bullet. And God knows this country has had enough of the latter. But you're not alone in espousing this argument. Over the past decade, people in positions of power and influence across Ireland have suggested other ways to gain political power or to make change in our lives. The Irish Daily Star said these two bankers should be shot. That's one way of making change. But what's interesting about the Irish Star was there wasn't one voice from academic to media to condemn that fascist front page. Oh, most people I talked to said, it's just Irish, we don't mean it. Tell that to the people in the Third Reich. Tell that to Mussolini followers who are told, I'll get you the trains on time. We then had Vincent Browne on a European election say, upcoming election just a waste of time. You do what you want with that. I asked Mr. Browne to meet with me for a few minutes to discuss it. No response. The Irish Times editor, Mr. Sullivan, came to the honourable, wonderful Trinity College, and he told journalistic students, don't do too much muckraking. could be damaging. Well, Mr. Editor of the Irish Times, there'd be no need for muckraking if there was no muck. It's not just confined to the mass media, however. We recently had a member of Dáil Éireann, Mr. Paul Murphy, who once again I'd love to confront in the arena of ideas, who said, and I quote, "I was elected to break the law." I find it frightening. Not from Paul Murphy. I find it frightening that there wasn't a word in opposition from those who have access to power and influence in this country. Not a word. I was elected to break the law. If you get 0.001% of the Irish people who believe that, you've got 4,000 people. The IRA at its peak, from what I understand, was never more than 1,500. Words do have consequences. Words have consequences, Mr. Trump, and the truth does matter. Lies by people in positions of power and influence can have a dramatic effect on government policy. No better example than the recent Right to Water marches in Dublin, when the organisers told the media that many of the marches had over 80,000 to 100,000 people, and the entire Irish mass media dutifully reported those inaccurate numbers without fact-checking. Nonsense. There was never more than 10,000 people in any one of those 9 marches. Most had less than 8,000. How do I know? I measured O'Connell Street. O'Connell Street is 19,685 inches long, 1,872 inches wide, with a maximum shoulder to shoulder. From Parnell Monument to O'Connell Monument, you could get in 26,000 people. Incidentally, this morning on the Pat Kenny Show, Mr. Brendan Ogle, chair of Right to Water, stated that the numbers in the marches ranged from 200,000 to 100,000. I counted 4 of those marches. In one of them, the media reported there was at least tens of thousands. By any definition of that phrase, 30,000 or more. I counted it in Stephen's Green. There was approximately 3,600 people. Words and numbers do matter. I call Mr. Trump an idiot. He's an idiot. He's an idiot because of the meaning of the word idiot from the Greek idioscele, which means somebody who knows nothing about politics. So it's not mean to say, Mr. Trump, you're an idiot. You are a bloody idiot because you know nothing about politics. You know nothing about the cornerstones of democracy. Part of the reason so many people are disenchanted with politics, I feel, is that voting is a waste of time is due to the mass media. What do I mean by the mass media? There's 3 types: the sleaze media, the intellectual media, and the great bulk of the mass media that most of us are affected by. 3 out of 5 people in the United States have little trust in the mass media. I do not know what it is in Ireland. I cannot find out because no one's interested. But I suggest it is considerably less. What happened in the Donald Trump campaign to move him from 16th of 17 contenders to getting the Republican nomination? Very interesting. What happened from 16th to 17th? I suggest to you it is entirely due to the coverage of the Republican primary campaign by the mass media. They created the monster because they want headlines. On the 16th of June 2015, when Trump announced his candidacy for President of the United States, Donald Trump was 200 to 1 with the English and Irish bookmakers. He was at about 3% of the vote in every poll. What happened in the next 12 months to have his odds shortened to 2 to 1? I suggest to you it was the entire Western mass media that gave him wall-to-wall media coverage. The more outrageous Mr. Trump became, the greater the coverage in both print and electronic. It had been reported that Trump received over $2 billion, $2 billion in free media coverage. One scandal every day, if not every day, every other day. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, the big issue for the entire media, for the entire campaign, was emails. And I'll take you out and buy you an ice cream and a Kit Kat chocolate bar if you can tell me what law she has broken. Has the media made an effort to find out and answer that question? Very similar to the build-up of the war in Iraq in 2003. A Harvard University study showed that out of 187 major news reports, 184 could only be described as drumbeats for war. The public was being conditioned that Saddam, the tyrant, had to go, and go, the West went into war. Just like today, the entire corporate mass media is creating a new Cold War between East and West. An almost daily coverage of how wicked Russia and Putin, the dictator, are. So let me close with this. Once again, the drumbeats for more military expenditures. Putin, the Russians, they're all evil. It's happening again. And we don't talk about it. We're afraid to. We're afraid to in case we lose our jobs or we don't get promoted or the peer pressure of our own peers belittle us. So with Trump today, from being a virtual first-round dropout, I suggest to you that Donald Trump got the nomination of the Republican Party because of his anti-handicap comments, his racist, his xenophobic, his Islamophobic, his sexist attitude, and his sexist behavior material. That's why he got it. He got it because he was given coverage. He should have been denied coverage and asked to explain it before any respectable media organization would put it on the airwaves or in print. And I'm not denying I had an organization called the Irish Free Speech Movement, so don't try to trick me on that one.
I'll have to call time if you could come to a conclusion, please.
I'll come to a conclusion, thank you. I didn't hear the second bell go. I must have been shouting so loud. I will close with a quote from the chairman of CBS Television Corporation, the most watched television entity in the United States. A direct quote. With their round-the-clock razzle-dazzle coverage of Trump's campaign, network chiefs knew well the destruction they were wreaking on the body politic of the U.S. and its people. In February 2016, these words are not mine. I hope you'll never forget them. CBS Chairman Les Monreevy said, and I quote, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. Man, who would have expected the ride we're all having right now? The money's rolling in, and this is fun. It's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Bring it on. Keep it going." Incidentally, Donald Trump doesn't have a chance of winning the election. Zero. Why? Because a majority of Americans have more sense and a majority are more concerned in building bridges than walls. If I may just take 30 seconds more and share something with you.
Yes, you can do it in 30 seconds.
30 seconds. My comments have ended. This is a copy. I voted 3 weeks ago through the mail for the California election where I lived. Irish people a few years ago were very upset because they had 2 referenda to vote on and a European seat. Oh my God, that's awfully complicated. Here on the American California, you voted for 28 items, all in the one ballot. And I'd love to close by reading you the 60th measure. Are you ready? I'm not making this up. This is a yes or no vote by the California electorate, all 35 million of them. The initiative requires that adult film performers use condoms during the filming of sexual intercourse. Come on, a little laughter. Don't take this serious. For God's sake. It requires producers to pay the performers vaccination fees. My closing thought in jest is, who the hell, what bureaucrat will get the job to inspect the movie houses to see that they're being used?
Absolutely. Okay. So Sarah isn't the only American here, and I have to say, I knew things were going to be a little weird when I came to Europe, but I really never anticipated being in a chamber debate about the politics of a country that I consciously chose to leave 3,000 miles and an ocean behind me. Even though I'm an expat, though, I don't think you're ever going to find anyone who has more respect for America's commitment to freedom of expression, to political engagement, and to democracy. But that being said, just because I respect the American tradition of political participation doesn't necessarily mean that it's fair to be pressured into participating in it. And it's because this may be my first election cycle, but this is also the first election cycle in which I see no candidates that I agree with, that I refuse to be pressured into voting for voting's sake, and that's why I stand on proposition. So let's look at some of the arguments about, why proposition wins. So just to clarify, again, this resolution is specifically set in the context of the US election. And in the context of the US election, presidential elections function differently from other types of elections in a couple different ways. First of all, in a presidential election, obviously you're voting for the leader of the executive branch. And more than any other branch of the government, the executive branch ends up being restrained by checks and balances. So the president on his or her own can't pass bills, can barely execute executive orders, like we've seen most of Obama's struck down by the judicial branch, and is beholden to Congress to cooperate on policy-making initiatives. The real driver behind US policymaking is the legislative branch, is Congress. And regardless of whether Hillary or Trump wins this election, they'd better pray to God that they have Congress on their side and that they're not presiding over a divided government. That's what we saw under the Obama administration, and it absolutely destroyed most of his policy initiatives, right? It made Obamacare so much less efficient than it could have been, because he constantly had to modify what he wanted Obamacare to be so he could appease the Republicans and get any semblance of universal health care passed. And what we see now is a broken shell of the initial plan that he proposed. It wastes billions of dollars a year, and it's far less effective than what it could have been. So no matter who's in the Oval Office, ultimately, Congress holds the reins, and they're still beholden to the judicial branch. They make or break American laws. They are the branches that matter. The president is a figurehead, but they don't matter nearly as much, in terms of actual policy making, as everyone makes them out to be. But beyond that, the presidential election is also the only one that relies upon the electoral college system. So the way that the Electoral College works, I don't know if people know this in Ireland, but is that there's a body of people who are official, professional like electors who actually decide who becomes president. So these electors cast their ballots based on how the people, like the general civilian population in their state voted. It's like a mini election after the election, and it's based on how the general election went, but it's the one that actually determines who becomes president. But that means that when regular people vote, we're not voting directly for the president. We're voting to tell the Electoral College who to vote for on our behalf. But the problem is that this college uses a winner-take-all system, which means that if a candidate receives even 51% of a state's vote, they get all of that state's members of the Electoral College. If you're one of the 49% in that state who didn't support that candidate, your vote literally doesn't matter. No one in the Electoral College is going to voice your opinion. That's especially important, like for me personally, because I live in New Jersey, for example, which has voted Democrat in every presidential election since 1992. Like by every projection, by every poll, Hillary Clinton is going to win our state, and therefore 100% of our members of the Electoral College by a pretty wide margin. But like I can't in good faith support Hillary Clinton. I campaigned for Bernie, but I am not voting for Hillary Clinton. But what that means is that if I were to vote for a different candidate who wasn't Hillary, it literally wouldn't matter. No members of the Electoral College would voice my opinion after I mailed out that ballot. Which means that whether or not I vote, like I have absolutely no impact on the Electoral College and therefore like on who becomes president in the long run. This is the only type of election in which the straight up general election popular vote is completely disregarded. It's the only type of election in which my vote is either diluted or ignored based on the majority of the state that I live in. That doesn't happen in any other kind of race. It only happens in the race for the presidency. If I know that my vote is going to be thrown out anyway, because I'm not going to vote for Hillary in a state that's overwhelmingly blue, then I know that I have no voice. So for two reasons, because the executive is powerless anyway, and because presidential elections are run by the Electoral College, presidential elections are institutionally, uniquely, and specifically the worst form of civic engagement. But second, let's address issues with the candidates themselves. The most glaring one being that like every single one of them is absolutely terrible. If I were to vote for a major candidate, obviously it would be either Trump or Hillary, Republican or Democrat. So basically I have the option of like a serial like liar or just an absolute buffoon. They're both massively unethical, they're both liars, and they're both people that I wouldn't invite over for dinner, never mind like into the White House, right? So they cannot and do not cancel each other out. Just because one is bad doesn't mean that the other isn't. So people try to use the phrase lesser of two evils, that because one is less bad than the other, you have to vote for the less bad option. But the lesser of two evils is still evil. And to vote for evil is to be glaringly and openly complicit in whatever policies they institute once they get into office. So if I vote for Trump and Trump wins the election because I think he's the lesser of two evils, then it's my fault when he decides that he's going to start an international incident and nuke China. Right? Just because he was the lesser of two evils doesn't mean he won't have a horrible policy like that. Same thing with Clinton. If I vote for Hillary, it is my fault when the entire administration becomes beholden to corporate donors and banks and the other institutions that back her, the same institutions that caused the 2008 financial crisis. Just because you think one of them is less evil doesn't make them not evil. So yes, they're both bad. But after the election, that's what matters. And after the election, when one of them gets into office, they're still going to be making bad policies, even if they're not as bad as the candidate of the other party. And just because they're not as bad as the, sure, actually, yeah.
So you said that you're a Bernie supporter.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that you don't want to be part of the policies that President Clinton would promote,
mm-hmm.
She's talking about a lot of the same kind of thing that Bernie proposed, such as paid family leave, increased rights for women.
She is now that she saw how popular Bernie was.
No, but she's, I can't.
So hypothetically, I could still vote for a third-party candidate, right? But come on, we've been over this with all the other prop speakers. We have Gary, who's a nice enough guy, but just because I'd invite him to a barbecue or something doesn't mean he's qualified to be president. He doesn't know where Aleppo is, which I've known since I was 13, and I'm not campaigning to be president of the United States. Then there's Jill Stein, who has the incredible superpower of defying all logic. I didn't know that Harvard Medical School could produce anti-vaxxers. There is literally no one in this election cycle that I can, in good faith, say I agree with. And I refuse to vote for someone that I don't agree with. The purpose of a vote is to voice your opinion. The purpose of a vote is to support someone who you stand behind, who you agree with, and who you believe in. And if you don't feel that way about anyone, then it is your right as an American not to support someone that you don't. So therefore, I stand on PrEP. Everyone should as well.
I do. Just to clarify, my name is actually Hannah Sophia Cogan. Sorry about that. But anyway, so ladies and gentlemen, members of the proposition, fellow members of the opposition, I am happy to oppose the motion that this House would not vote in the US presidential election. I would like to start by offering some rebuttal to the proposition. To the first speaker, I'm very sorry, I can't remember your name. But even if our individual votes do not count for much, this argument is not substantial enough to convince me that voting in itself is a futile exercise. Because if you don't vote, somebody will still win. And in forfeiting your right to partake in the democratic process, you also forfeit your right to be taken seriously if you then decide to complain about the outcome. I'd also like to offer some rebuttal to Kate. Yeah, it's true, presidents do need congressional approval to do a lot of things, but something very, very important that they don't need congressional approval to do is to act, to order military strikes on other countries that would constitute acts of war. Presidents do not need congressional approval to do this. And for this reason alone, I think that voting in every presidential election is absolutely a moral obligation of all US citizens. So, no thank you. So to begin my first point, I'm going to speak firstly about the obligation that US citizens have to vote, given the impact that US elections can and do have on an international scale. The US is the ultimate global powerhouse, and when citizens vote in presidential elections, they are not only choosing the leader of their own country, but many would say the leader of the free world. And what happens in the US has serious repercussions for the rest of us. And US citizens must therefore accept that they don't only have a responsibility to themselves and their own country, but to the world and humanity at large. They must remember that there are people who will be hugely affected by the outcome of this election who won't get a say in it themselves. If a president has weak economic policies that lead to the dollar collapsing, it's not only the US that will suffer, it's entirely possible that the result could be a global depression, and I'm not catastrophizing here because this has happened, and arguably more than once. And let's also not forget the actual US citizens living within the US who will not get to vote, because only 1 in 4 people who earn less than $10,000 per annum will make it to the polls. There's also a lot of voter suppression going on in the southern states. And if you decide to stay at home, if you decide not to vote, then you are expressing indifference to these problems and you're saying that you don't care because you have not taken up your chance to help give a voice to the voiceless, and this is simply inexcusable. So I say that US citizens are obliged to choose and vote for the candidate who they believe will not only best represent their own interests, but will also act responsibly on an international level. Because this person will have unprecedented power to wage war. Their policies will decide who gets access to essential resources, housing, education, healthcare, not only within the time frame of their term, but for years to follow. US presidents define entire generations, and consequently, US citizens have more of a moral responsibility to exercise their right to vote than anybody else in the world. But the global consequences of US elections can stretch even further than this. I will speak now about how the responsibility to vote in this election in particular is absolutely crucial, given the current state of international relations. Political commentators such as Oxford professor Philip N. Howard have recently begun to speculate that a second Cold War may be looming in the near future. And I think that this is certainly a distinct possibility, seeing as there has undeniably been increasing military tension between opposing geopolitical power blocs, the two main players being a US-NATO coalition and the old Eastern European communist powers headed by the Russian Federation. And this Cold War 2.0 has the potential to be much more sinister than previous conflicts, as it could quite possibly be the first ever cyber war. But even if you disagree with the commentators, even if you think that this is unlikely to happen, you cannot dismiss the possibility, and you must decide who you would prefer to have at the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin, who you would rather see lead your country through a war. Some say the Russians want Trump to win the election because he has expressed a sympathetic, even admiring attitude towards Putin's administration. Alternatively, Putin may be planning on illicitly using him as a means to infiltrate the US, though Trump has proven himself to be somewhat of a loose cannon, which would make him difficult to work with or manipulate. Others say the Russians want Clinton to win because she is certainly more predictable. She would therefore possibly be easier to defeat. However, it cannot be denied that her wealth of experience in diplomacy and negotiation would make her a formidable opponent. Weigh up your options because the choice is yours. And I'm not trying to pretend, no thank you, that the choice is easy. Trump and Clinton have some of the highest disapproval ratings in US election history. But voting for a candidate does not necessarily mean that you are endorsing them or even that you approve of them. This brings me on to my next point, that people need not feel as though they are abandoning their personal moral code in voting for a candidate who they dislike. They are simply choosing the candidate who they feel will do the best job or perhaps cause the least damage. And ladies and gentlemen, we must remember that a bad choice is still a choice. In voting, you do not forfeit your right to criticize or express opposition to the person for whom you have voted. If anything, voting legitimizes your voice. Citizens have the right to speak openly and publicly about any grievances they have with the political regime, and after having voted for a candidate, you are still perfectly entitled to condemn them. Because say what you will about the US, but it does guarantee citizens' right to freedom of speech. But if somebody relinquishes the right to partake in the democratic process, they cannot then be taken seriously if they decide to criticize it, as that would be a gross contradiction. You can vote and still publicly oppose the person for whom you voted because that is your right. It is protected by the Constitution, and you may exercise it however and whenever you see fit. But to not vote at all is a childish and lazy solution, the political equivalent of throwing your rattle from the pram. It is nothing but an avoidance strategy and a complete abandonment of one's civic duty. Now, some may argue that American democracy is flawed. Some may even say that the US is not in fact a democracy, but an oligarchy. I say that while these sentiments may in some ways be accurate, that not voting is not the way to express them. And this leads me on to my last point. That maybe it's unfair that there are only two main political parties. Maybe voters do have a lack of choice. But there is one thing that we can always be certain of, and I know that the Florida recount in 2000 was a bit of an anomaly, but that was mostly to do with the hanging Chad controversy. It's not going to happen again because I think we've all been permanently scarred. Okay, but everybody is guaranteed equality within the polling booth, and no matter how disenfranchised you are, no matter how alienated you feel from the political process, your vote will be counted. The only thing that Trump and Clinton seem to agree on, actually, is that everybody should vote. And for these reasons, I urge you all to oppose the motion. Thank you.
I am a massive Doctor Who fan.
Like, not just David Tennant or New Who or even Classic Who. I mean, the whole shebang. Comics and books and spin-off audio dramas. Oh. My car is littered with Doctor Who CDs, and my bedroom at home has this wonderful To Victory Dalek poster from, the episode with Churchill when they send the Spitfires up into space to defeat the Dalek fleet. It's sad. It's my dirty little secret. But I don't outwardly express it, I don't want people getting the wrong idea. Tweeting a picture of the latest Doctor Who poster could utterly ruin my rather average Twitter aesthetic. We all put up these facades. We hide who we really are in one way or another. We all pretend to be something that we're not to fit in to society. So this House would not vote. When I first saw this motion, I thought, how stupid. Bloody Phil trying to shove their neoliberal armchair politics agenda down our throat again. I thought it's our civic duty to vote. But then Louis Hoffman said he was going on opposition, and I thought, well, it's a sad day when I agree with Louis Hoffman on something. So here we are. To those of you who don't get that joke, you will after his speech. So I'm Ferdy Emmett, and I'm here to argue, why the hell should you vote if you really don't give a flying duck? Yes, that was duck. Apparently I get fined, so I had to improv. Voting is supposedly the ultimate democratic duty. People who vote are often seen as lazy or stupid. We're told time and time again that our vote matters. Our media is overwhelmed by reports on this or that, and to not engage in the political issues of our time is almost seen as unpatriotic. But let's look at the facts. The general consensus this year that either Hillary or Donald are the lesser of two evils. In Ireland, neither Martin or Kenny are even that exciting, but it's time for pretty much nothing apart from their own egos. Over 40% of voters in British, surveyed by the BBC, regretted their vote. What I'm trying to say is that by forcing people to vote, to hide behind this facade of I'm a good citizen and I care about my country, we get people going into the polling booth and staring at the piece of paper and still not knowing what option to choose. I'm not standing up here saying that the entire population should abstain from voting because that's silly. Apologies, Andrew. What I'm arguing is that we should instill the ideal into people that voting, we shouldn't instill the ideal that voting is an obligation. So many people in the world feel they have to vote because it's what society tells them to do, and then they essentially flip a coin. An uneducated vote is far worse than no vote because it screws up the results. I have absolutely no idea who I voted for in the student election last year, student union election. To be honest, I ticked the names that looked the nicest and avoided the people whose campaigners seriously irritated me in the arts block. And I don't think I'm the only one. I mean, is that what we want from RSU? Is that what politics has been debased to? Why don't we educate the populace, I hear you call, but I'm sorry that doesn't work. The Referendum Committee in Ireland is perhaps one of the only unbiased bodies of its kind in the world. And let's be honest, did anyone here actually read their report for the marriage referendum? No. We were overrun by shouts of, they'll destroy your families, which hasn't happened, or yes, equality, which, let's be honest, isn't really the case because people of the LGBT community aren't fully equal in the eyes of the law. Media and political bias will shape every election across the globe, and it's hard to find time to step back and actually do your own research. And also, some people just aren't bothered. If you really couldn't care less about abortion, if you feel it in no way affects you or anyone you know and really can't be bothered to find out more about it, why should you feel an obligation to vote on it? Surely leaving it up to the people who have researched, who have campaigned, who know all aspects of the issue is far more beneficial to society. Why should society tell you it's your obligation when you don't have a clue and couldn't care less? Like Doctor Who fans, non-voters are shunned and judged by society. People should have an interest in politics, just like all of you should have an interest in Doctor Who. But we can't force you to do it, and we shouldn't force them, and we shouldn't judge them. Hannah said a vote doesn't mean an endorsement, but my God, it does. To put the effort in to go to the polling station is an endorsement in itself, because you have gone there and you have thought about it and you've given them the tick. Ideally, I'd like Jill Stein to win. I mean, I think she's as much a crazy egotist as Trump. But her Facebook lifetime is probably longer than the entire 50-year run of Doctor Who. Her policies most align with mine, but I actually feel Hillary Clinton is a nicer person. And that's saying a lot. But Stein will never actually win. So what's the point? To show the media that a third-party candidate can do well. Stein could get up to 30% of the public vote and still not win a single electoral college vote. No one in the mainstream media is going to look at that 30% and, well, in her bloody dreams. For the American system is screwed up. And either way, with Trump or Clinton, America will turn out the same. We can dream that Trump's basically Hitler, but he has so many people to answer to. So much legislation in place, the Supreme Court, Senate, and Congress. And through all his idiotic comments, he's not an idiot. And to go against Kate, sorry, I actually think dinner with Trump would be actually quite fun. I think Clinton's more likely to start a war and ignore the lower classes. They're both terrible. I feel so uninspired and bored, and I really couldn't care who wins. Screw my democratic duty. This House will not vote because this House shouldn't bloody well have to. Every few years, Doctor Who changes his face. It's the same person, but supposedly with different personalities and ideals and inspirations. But it's a TV show, you know, it's not really him that defines the show. It's the people behind the scenes, the writers, the actors, producers, even the viewers. They mold the show. The Doctor changes aspects to keep up ratings, like the American president. They change, supposedly with different ideals and inspirations, but it's a show. They change to keep up ratings. David Tennant's people's favorite, not because he was David Tennant, but because he was given better scripts, better people to work with, and a producer that knew what to do with the show. No one person is Doctor Who, just like no one person is the President of America. Our vote doesn't matter unless we want it to matter. So if you don't like or weren't inspired by my speech, just don't fill out the oratory returns. No vote is always better than a low vote. Don't vote, ladies and gentlemen, and screw the stigma. Thank you.
Final speaker, attention please, final speaker to oppose the proposition, would you please welcome Louis Hoffman, ladies and gentlemen, senior freshman in history.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Louis Hoffman, and today I am strongly opposing the motion that this House would not vote. All we have heard so far are lies, falsehoods and fallacies, the incomprehensible ramblings of pseudo-intellectual fascists who wish to tear down the very bedrock of our society by abstaining from voting. Before we can begin the process of defeating this motion, we must remember that the proposition is forgetting the obligation we owe to the martyrs of free speech. For centuries, the crisp red blood of heroes has been spilt and shed to gain and maintain the right to be free, the right to live in a fair society, and the right to vote on who rules over us. The privilege of voting has been hard-earned, and rightly so. It is one of the most beautiful things that Western civilization has borne, and now the proposition wishes to throw it away. They believe that by not voting, one is somehow making some form of edgy political statement. But this is utterly and completely untrue. By abstaining from voting, we do nothing other than endanger the very concept of democracy. We risk losing freedom of speech and the right to political expression. I do not deny that in many ways democracy is a flawed system. Much like any human creation, it has its failings. But by not voting, all we are doing is politically cock-blocking ourselves. Political activism and voting is our moral duty, and by abstaining, all we are doing is handicapping society. Democracy requires the consent and active participation of the people. If the people refuse to work within the democracy, then the democracy ceases to work. For our system of government gains its legitimacy from the will of the people. Once we withdraw that, the state ceases to be legitimate, and then hence the collapse of it is inevitable. What then would follow this? Tyranny, hatred, oppression, and death. Is this far preferable to 4 years under Clinton or Trump? By not voting, you are in fact limiting your freedom of speech. Indeed, a democracy does, it's a no for me. Indeed, a democracy requires the surrendering of certain rights to the government in order that they can protect the society at large. But now you wish to surrender the right to choose who impedes upon your rights, who chooses what tax rates you pay, and who decides whether you go to war or not. Where is the logic or rationale behind this? What makes it even scarier is the fact that across society we see the large oppression of freedom of speech. The progressive tidal wave ever more constricts the rights of the individual. Even this, a debating society, has not escaped unscathed and has now become infected with political correctness mania. Sorry, lads. What I am trying to reiterate is that all around us, people are constantly trying to oppress and control what we say. It seems counterintuitive then to voluntarily assist them by refusing to vote and allowing the small minority to rule over the silent majority. Now, a lot of what we hear every day and have heard in this debate is about the broken American system, and this is where you're going to see what Ferdy meant. But in this election, you've been granted the most anti-establishment candidate that has ever been, Donald J. Trump. If you want change, take it. If you want more of the same, then of course vote for Hillary. Though I don't like her at all, I definitely support your right to make your voice heard and to vote for her. If the country decides that she's the best candidate, then I shall accept the will of the people, and that in itself is the beauty of democracy. It is important to remember that when not voting, in essence all you are doing is voting for your least favourite candidate. Now, I can feel the cries of shame brewing and my chances of pulling after this debate decreasing as I profess my love for Trump. But what I'm trying to say is that when you've been granted such a candidate who is literally the manifestation of populism and wholeheartedly against the corruption that has become embedded in our society, then why turn our nose up at it when it is constantly what we ask for?
But Louis.
No, I'm all right. Every part of this, I spent far too long writing this. Every part of the establishment attacks this man because they know his election is the beginning of the end. The lack of professionalism in the establishment media, I don't mean you, Dobbo, don't worry. Why complain about the broken system and then not advocate the election of someone who wants to fix it? It just makes no sense. What Trump represents is the insatiable demand for change, the direct manifestation of the people's wills. Oh, Jesus Christ, lads, come on. Look, just let me come on, and now back a candidate who wishes to do the same. He represents the inevitable swing to the right as people grow tired of being lied to, grow tired of the same excuses, grow tired of the incessant American wars of interest. Now I know he really isn't the perfect candidate. He has many flaws, but what he represents is the will of the people who want to usher in change. And no other system of government is change so easily affected. Granted, you don't have to support him, but please support those who do. For if we don't make our voices heard and counted, then what we get is our Julius Caesar who comes along and destroys our beloved republic. Willful political expression is one of the most fantastic, beautiful, and ideologically sound things in the world. Our method of democracy allows people to come together despite our differences and work together for the greater good. Democracy is more important than simply voting. It represents the very bedrock of Western civilization, and to turn our backs upon democracy and to abstain from voting would start the destruction of the greatest society that ever was and ever has been. I'm not saying democracy is easy. It isn't. It's tough. You don't always get the options you're happy with, but that's life. Yes, you may believe you're being an edgy college liberal, but going, well, sorry, mate, I don't actually agree with either of the candidates. But tough. Democracy is about making tough decisions, looking at your options and making a decision on what you believe to be your best option. Life isn't some little safe space where you can hide away from responsibility. It isn't wise nor smart to turn away. It isn't wise nor smart to turn away from voting because you don't agree with the candidate. It proves you to be an infantile and a coward, incapable of logical thought. If you don't want to challenge yourself, if you don't want to help affect change, if you never want to have to deal with responsibilities, well then piss off back to secondary school. What I have seen today genuinely terrifies me. I see a room of supposed intellectuals, the future of this country, willing to turn their back on what made it great. Join me, my brothers and sisters. Join the revolution from contemporary thought. We may disagree politically, but regardless of this, it is of the utmost importance you vote. Whether Hillary or Trump, I implore you to take a stance and not abstain. And if for some God-forsaken reason you decide to not vote, remember this phrase: don't vote, don't bitch. Thank you.
low turnout, when so much it seems to me is at stake, the small number of people, relatively speaking, who come out, usually maybe 50 or less than 50%. And identified again a very significant aspect of the American system, that the primary process, the primary electoral process, tends to produce the most hardline candidates, certainly in the Republican context. Traditionally then, of course, we've seen them tack to the centre ground to try and win the general election, and Donald Trump, of course, has done nothing of the sort. And also remind you, of course, that there's a lot more, as Vincent did, to elections than the top ballot. There's a great many other people to be issues and propositions to be decided on as one goes down through it. Mr. Andrew Connolly. Sorry, I did make some notes here. He said, look, yes. Oh, yes. Mr. Connolly struck me as Mr. Connolly is the gentleman with friends from Libya, the United States, and Navan. Catholic in his taste, I would say, at the very least. I think, if I may say so, the quote of the evening, I don't know if it's original or whether you borrowed it, Mr. Connolly, but you can't fix the system when the system is fixed. And I guess a lot of it is an original quote, but I think that deserves certainly our appreciation, as you got all the time. And that is a very compelling argument, I think, for people to stay away, to boycott, in effect, the democratic process, because it is futile given the nature of how broken the system is. So don't vote, you urge before. The difficulty, I think, with Mr. Connolly's presentation was that he didn't offer an alternative. So what is the alternative? To join the Symbionese Revolutionary Army, to kidnap an heiress, and to start blowing up hot dog stands and coffee stalls? I'm not sure what the alternative, and I'd like to try to elucidate on that. Mr. Vincent Lavery did offer us the alternative, very clearly. He told us in ringing tones that political change either comes about through the ballot or the bullet. That is the choice, and it seemed to me that cut through a lot of the debate that we heard tonight. That if you want political change, really those are the only two alternatives. He talked, and I was very interested, Vincent, in your remarks about the numbers and attending water protests, and you're quite right to say that it's an issue that we in the media shirked, because we didn't do what you did, went out and measured the street, and I think that's something we might actually look at. But I think we shirked it, and we took just the figures that were presented by the protesting organisations themselves. Garda Síochána, who used to give estimates to media organisations like ours, simply stopped doing it because they were getting caught in the crossfire as well. And in relation to the media, he asked the question, what has happened to trust in the media? It's a major concern for people like me that trust in the people I work with and the work we do is declining. It's something that's an enormous challenge to our role in society, because if people don't trust us, then we have nothing. All the rest is really just the flam around that. And I think you're quite right to say that Trump was a godsend to the American media. Really, they created him. They rode that tiger. The money poured in, as you identified, and they're now seeing the consequences, reaping the consequences, and more importantly, the American people are reaping the consequences of that. Kate Kleinle, our second American speaker this evening, she reminded us very often the deadlock that takes place in Washington, where you have a president of one party and a Congress which is controlled by the opposition party. And she said we can overstate, arguing to oppose the proposition, she said you can overstate the significance of the office of the president. And I'm sure that's right, and the distorting effect of the electoral college system. But every electoral system, of course, distorts to some extent. The recent British general election gave the Scottish Independence Party in Scotland, I think it was 50% of the vote in the Westminster election. They got all but one of the seats at Westminster because of first past post. Every system, I think it's fair to say, distorts to some extent. And she made the point in her own state, I think it's New Jersey, Hillary Clinton will win. And of course, the consequence of that is the candidates don't, as I understand it, campaign in those states even. They don't even visit them. So you'll see them in Ohio, you'll see them in Florida, you'll see them in Pennsylvania in the next number of days, but not in the states like New Jersey, which are already ticked up there. And that, of course, is a very, I think, disempowering aspect of the American system. I think, interestingly, Kate introduced us to the dining out principle of making your choices in political elections. She said she wouldn't have Hillary to dinner, but she would invite Gary Johnson to a barbecue. I said, I'd like to come as well. Very quickly towards the conclusion, Hannah Sophia Cogan talked about, I think we can't dismiss it, the risk of World War III, where Donald Trump to get into the White House. I'm imagining Mr. Trump proof that. Now, there was a train of thought in there somewhere. I will find it, I promise you. I think there was one problematic notion that Mr. N introduced, and this is the notion of the uneducated vote, or if you will, the uneducated voter. And the problem here, of course, is who decides that the vote is uneducated. The very fact, it seems, of somebody, as you said yourself, getting up and going down to the polling booth and casting their ballot suggests to me they have a desire to exercise a choice. And I really have a difficulty with deciding that one person is educated, or one vote is educated, and one is not sufficiently educated. Finally, Mr. Louis Hoffman, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's fair to describe it as an impassioned speech. Democracy loses its legitimacy, and who could really argue with this? Democracy loses its legitimacy when the people refuse to participate. That, of course, is true, has been true down through many long years, that when the people withdraw their support for the democratic process, it suffers irreparable damage. I am intrigued, though, that Mr. Hoffman brought tonight to us the gift of prophecy. He declared, Donald Trump represents the will of the people. Mr. Hoffman, the election is on Tuesday. Just a final thought. I hesitate to share this with you, but I will anyway for what it's worth. Many years ago, as a young reporter, I got a dream assignment. I was sent to South Africa. The year was 1994, so it is a long time ago now. And the reason I was sent to South Africa in the year of 1994 was because the people of South Africa, all the people of South Africa, black, white, coloured, brown, mixed race, all of them, for the first time in the history of that great country, had the opportunity to vote. Until 1994, black South Africans, who composed the vast majority of citizens of that country, were excluded from the electoral process. Nelson Mandela, a great leader, was released from jail by the apartheid-like government of South Africa in the years running up to 1994. A new settlement of South Africa was negotiated, and the result was an election that took place in March of 1994, right across that vast country. And as a young reporter, I watched and witnessed thousands of black South Africans come out of their homes and their shanty houses, sometimes in the most appalling conditions, to stand, in some cases for days, to queue for days, to do what? To cast their vote. To cast their vote. To have their voice heard for the first time. It was an amazing and a humbling, and for me, a life-changing experience. I would never again